Lawmakers are set to take on the criminal justice system. Welcome to Faith Nation. I'm Jenna Browder.
And I'm John Jessup. A vote on criminal justice reform will take place on the Senate floor in the coming days. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell promised, or rather surprised many this week when he announced the Senate will decide on a measure known as the First Step Act during the lame duck session. If passed, it would be the largest prison sentencing overhaul in decades, and it has bipartisan support.
It does. This has been a priority for President Trump and his son-in-law, Jared Kushner. He has worked behind the scenes on criminal justice reform for the last 2 years or so. Although it's been in the works for a while, though, there are still a lot of questions about whether this new bill will really work to cut down on criminals returning to prison.
That's right. Amber Strong is with Georgetown law professor Shon Hopwood. Hopwood, along with other advocates, worked with the White House on the measure and is here to tackle some of those tough questions.
All right, let's get right to it. Question number one that we're hearing a lot from viewers, statistically speaking, do prison reform programs actually work?
They do, Amber. The programs that are in the First Step Act were modeled off of several different states that had success in both reducing the prison population, getting people out of prison early, and still watching their crime rate fall. And we know that certain programs already can reduce recidivism because the Federal Bureau of Prisons has one. The Residential Drug and Abuse Program, which has reduced recidivism by 16%. And so the First Step Act is evidence-based policies that, if implemented correctly, should reduce the number of people that come out and commit new offenses.
Number two, there is concern about this bill that it is going to allow violent offenders early release. Is that true?
It's not true, although I wish it were, because all of the data tells us that the people we most want to incentivize with early release are people who have committed violent offenses, because if we can rehabilitate them once they get out, they aren't committing new offenses. I mean, this is the central premise of First Step, which is 97% of people in federal prison are going to be released someday. Why wouldn't we want to incentivize people to be rehabilitated? And I'd say of any group of people, people that committed violent offenses are the people that most need to be incentivized to be rehabilitated. And yet the bill doesn't do that, in part because some senators have screamed about the release of violent prisoners, not understanding that that would actually make us safer.
We've had a lot of time to study mandatory minimum sentences and their effectiveness. Do they work? What have we learned about them over the years?
Well, they don't work for the reasons we once thought, which was to deter people. The thought that we're going to give somebody a 20-year mandatory minimum and it will deter other people. All of the data out there says that the chance of getting caught is what deters people and not the length of the sentence. And so mandatory minimums have basically taken away the discretion that judges have and given it to federal prosecutors, who are not nearly as knowledgeable about sentencing policy as federal judges are.
Let's throw one more in for good measure. What is something that you've heard? You've been so close to this bill. What is something you've heard that just simply isn't true about the First Step Act?
Well, some of the opponents in the Senate have said that this is a jailbreak bill. And the thing everyone needs to know about this bill is it's two things. It's one, incredibly modest reform. This does not release thousands of people out early. It releases some who have reduced their risk of recidivism out early, which is what we want. And second, it only provides 7 extra days of good time a year to everyone in federal prison. So for people serving a 20-year sentence, this is not going to lead to that much earlier release. And at the end of the day, this bill is both modest reform, but it's also the best reform bill of my lifetime to potentially come out of the U.S. Congress.
Wow. Shon, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Well, many faith leaders have voiced their support for the First Step Act. For more on that, we are joined now by Heather Rice-Minus of Prison Fellowship. Heather, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
Heather, why is this such an important issue for Christians?
Yeah, so for believers, you know, we want to see justice lived out. We want to bring hope to people. And that's why I think so many Christians are involved in prison ministry and going into inside the walls and telling people about the hope of the gospel. But I also believe as Christians that we are supposed to stand for justice. There's so many verses in the Bible that speak to this and standing up for those who can't speak for themselves. And right now, the criminal justice system, we have some serious issues in terms of people receiving disproportional sentences and people not having the skills and opportunities they need inside prison to really transform and come home as good neighbors, good citizens. And so that's why the First Step Act, that's what it's aiming to do.
Heather, often there's this social stigma that's associated with people who've been incarcerated. What role does the church play in helping overcome those stigmas? And why is it important that we realize that we have to play this role?
Right. For Christians, if you think of the grace we each receive in getting a second chance from Christ, we should be at the forefront of welcoming people home. We have a second chance in Christ, and I think we should offer a second chance to those who have paid their debt by opening up our congregations and welcoming them at home and letting them know that through Christ there is a fresh start.
Heather, how has Prison Fellowship been really helping to push this legislation forward?
So I have been in government affairs with Prison Fellowship for nearly 6 years, and about that entire time I've been working on some version of this bill. I am so excited that we are as close as we have ever been, and I believe it's going to happen. What that looks like for us is we are up on Capitol Hill and with the administration, meeting with offices, talking to them about how this bill matters from a Christian perspective. We have an army of grassroots Christian believers, many ministry volunteers, many people who have been touched by crime or incarceration in their own lives or with their families, who are also reaching out and contacting their legislators about the bill. And then we're working in coalition with a lot of different groups. A lot of other faith-based organizations have been at the forefront right there with us, along with secular groups. And it's a great coalition, and we're really looking to get this done and have a Christmas miracle.
Heather, I got to ask you, because there's a lot of focus, of course, on prison reform, criminal justice reform, which I think everybody can agree needs to be done.
Sure.
But what about, how do you balance that against the fact that you have a lot of folks who have been injured by some type of crime? How do you push something like this without looking like you've forgotten some of the victims of really serious crimes?
I would say if we don't think about prison reform, we are actually doing a disservice to victims. We believe at Prison Fellowship that crime is not just an offense against the state. It is harm to a direct victim often, and to the community. And we should be putting people in a system that allows for people to make amends and to earn back the public's trust. If all we're doing is warehousing people, we are actually doing a disservice to victims, because people are going to come back home, make new victims, and they're not going to take accountability for the harm that they have caused.
Yeah, and Heather, if this gets pushed through, what is next for Prison Fellowship?
Well, we have more work to do at the federal level. I think first and foremost, this bill will still require a lot of oversight and implementation, and so we are going to be continuing to watch the rollout of all the provisions of this bill very closely. In addition, we're working really hard on trying to expand prison education. We'd love to see Pell Grants restored to people who are incarcerated, for example. And then we also are very active at the state level. And in fact, the states have really pushed this movement forward. We have about 12 state campaigns, and they've been moving much quicker at passing reforms. And I think that's actually given Congress the courage to get where they are today on the First Step Act.
Heather Rice-Minas with Prison Fellowship, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much.
Well, House Republicans will not be voting this week on a measure to fund the government and provide money for border security. Lawmakers in the House are expected to recess tonight and not resume business until next Wednesday. That leaves just 2 days to pass funding before a partial government shutdown kicks in on December 21st. Money to pay for President Trump's border wall is a key part of that funding measure. Republicans and Democrats have locked horns over the president's promise to build a wall, and after a public display of the contentious dispute between top lawmakers and the president in the Oval Office, there's little hope of the two sides striking a deal. But that is the least of the president's problems right now, with his personal lawyer heading to prison for 3 years. The president is speaking out.
Well, joining us now to help break down all of this is our chief political analyst, David Brody. David, the president today on Twitter, let me get it right, Twitter declared that Mexico is paying for the wall and that savings from his new trade deal with Mexico and Canada are fulfilling that one campaign promise that one way or another Mexico will be paying. Is that something that his supporters will buy?
Well, I think his supporters will buy it because remember, Donald Trump didn't say Mexico is going to pay for the wall. What he said is, especially later, one way or the other, Mexico is going to pay for the wall. And that's the key. That's the wiggle room, one way or the other. And what does that mean? It can mean, look, a trade deficit and surplus with Mexico. In other words, if he can get $18 to $20 billion back, that pays for the wall. I know a lot of folks are saying that's pie in the sky, but that could be potentially what happens here, especially with that tweet he talked about with that new trade agreement.
Right.
There's also a talk about having a remittance fee on some sort of money that goes from U.S. individuals here to Mexico. In other words, folks are sending money back to their families there. So there's all different ways that the Trump administration will probably have to figure out how to do that because Mexico's not coming across here saying, here you go, Mr. Trump, here's a check.
One way or another, he's looking to fulfill that campaign promise.
That's right. That's exactly
David,
right.
you talked to the president about this and about Mexico paying for this wall.
Yeah, it was in January 2017, third interview he did, and we actually, at the time, the Trump administration was talking about an import tax, a border tax on goods coming in from Mexico, a 20% border tax, and that was part of our discussion. So have a look at what we talked about. This tax on Mexico or imports from Mexico into the United States. How serious are you about something like that?
Well, it's something that I have the right to do. It's something that I can impose if I want. We are getting along actually very well with the Mexican government. We'll see what happens.
If there was some sort of tax on imports, what about the argument that you've heard before about that? Indeed, it'll be passed along to consumers.
With respect to Mexico, something else could happen which would be much more positive for both Mexico and the United States.
So the reason we wanted to play that for you is to give you a sense that even back then, he was thinking of some creative way to figure out how Mexico was going to pay for this wall.
You know, we saw this week in that unforgettable Oval Office meeting with Chuck and Nancy.
Chuck and Nancy.
Where the president said he would own a government shutdown. We know that the deadline, the 21st, is right around the corner. Do you think the president will really do a shutdown over the border wall?
I think so. I think it's going to happen. As a matter of fact, I think I was on this program, if I can remember last week, I was here saying that I thought it was going to happen because this is his last best chance. It's not going to happen with Nancy Pelosi and the Democrats controlling Congress come January, so he's got to do it now. So I think he's going to do it. And look, it's important to point out that this is just a partial government shutdown, okay? So if we go through some of the agencies that will be closed, there's 5 of them specifically, DHS, Department of Homeland Security, there they are, DOJ, Department of Justice. You also have the Interior Department, State Department, and HUD, Housing and Urban Development. So it's a partial government shutdown. Basically, 75% of the government would be open, and even with those agencies there, many of those essential employees will still report. Still, it's over Christmas, and he's going to get dinged for it, for sure.
Yeah, David, the president, meantime, is trying to distance himself from his former personal attorney, Michael Cohen. He says he did not violate campaign finance laws. What's your take on this whole situation?
Yeah, well, the president now speaking out saying that he didn't violate campaign finance laws. Now, having said that, let's first talk about what he said on Twitter exactly, and here's the tweet. He said, many campaign finance lawyers stated that I did nothing wrong with respect to campaign finance laws, if they even apply, because this was not campaign finance. So, you know, basically what the Trump administration and specifically Donald Trump is arguing is that this was not campaign funds. These were his own personal funds, and that in essence, he didn't knowingly do it. And it was up to Michael Cohen to basically understand the laws, the rules, and that's on him, not on Trump. And I think that's the key. Did he knowingly actually try to influence the presidential campaign and do that? I think that's really the key to all of this. And also, Trump can make the argument to say, look, the reason I did it was because I was trying to protect my family. I was trying to protect the embarrassment to Melania and the kids and all of that. You can make that argument. It's very hard to prove intent in something like that.
To alter the campaign.
Right, and if it's not intent, if you can't prove intent, then it becomes civil. It doesn't become a felony, and I think that's the rub. That's the difference.
That's what we'll watch.
All right, David, thank you.
Thanks, guys.
David. Well, Nancy Pelosi, after much speculation, appears to have secured enough support to become the next House Speaker in January. For more on that, we turn to our Capitol Hill correspondent, Abigail Robertson. Abigail, how did Nancy Pelosi win over the support of skeptics in her bid to become the next House Speaker?
Well, John, she struck a deal with them. She said that if she becomes the next Speaker of the House, she agrees to serve no more than 4 years in the position. And almost immediately after she made this announcement, she won over about 7 of those who said that they were opposing her. So as of now, she has the votes in her party to be the next Speaker of the House.
Abigail, when will Democrats in the House officially vote for the next Speaker?
They'll vote in the whole House when they're back January 3rd and Democrats officially move into the majority in the House.
Abby, we know, contrary to White House statements over this issue, in the Senate today, lawmakers took action to rebuke Saudi Arabia over the killing of journalist Jamal Khashoggi.
Yes, there were 2 resolutions that passed the Senate this afternoon in regards to Saudi Arabia and rebuking the country for the death of the journalist Jamal Khashoggi. One of the resolutions said that the U.S. should stop aiding Saudi Arabia in the civil war in Yemen, and the other resolution said that the senators find that the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia is responsible for the death of the journalist. Now, neither one of these resolutions is expected to pass the House by the end of this year, but the Senate wanted to send a strong message to the longtime ally.
And finally, senators also took action to combat sexual harassment on the Hill. Is that right, Abby?
Yes, that is right, Jenna. Both the House and Senate passed major legislation that overhauls how Congress handles sexual harassment claims here on the Hill. This was a really big bill that they've been working on for months, and it's now on its way to the president's desk. And essentially, the main parts of the bill will protect victims that come forward. It strengthens the transparency of the process, and the huge part here that taxpayers will be very happy to hear, it makes it so that lawmakers are personally liable for any harassment and retaliation settlements that they have to pay. So taxpayers are no longer on the hook to pay for those settlements.
All right, Abigail Robertson for us on the Hill. Thanks, Abby. Well, coming up, a look at the growing number of non-U.S. citizens taking part in the welfare program.
Welcome back. Well, an argument you sometimes hear in the immigration debate is that those who come to the country will do jobs Americans won't do, making them good for the U.S. economy. But as Paul Strand explains, a new report shows some immigrants could be costing the country big money.
Taxpayers foot the bill for welfare programs, and non-citizens are adding plenty to that cost. Stephen Camerata of the Center for Immigration Studies has just added up all the numbers.
We found that 63% of households headed by non-citizens had one or more people in that household using at least one welfare program.
That's almost double the rate of American-born citizens.
In terms of food programs or Medicaid, the share of immigrant households with somebody using it is about twice that of the native-born.
This is what happens when millions of low-wage, less educated immigrants flood the nation.
If you bring in low-wage workers, they, and very often their U.S.-born children, qualify for a host of programs. If you had to put it into a bumper sticker, it's that there's a high cost to cheap labor.
These folks are also 3 times as likely to be uninsured, causing Americans to bear much more cost.
Non-citizens in general and immigrants in general have very high rates of lacking insurance, usually double or triple that of the native-born. But what happens when someone shows up in an emergency room? They're going to get care. We're not going to not that, and it's going to come at taxpayer expense anyway.
Or at the expense of other sick people, who those hospitals will just hit with much higher bills to make up for those who got their care for free. Camerata points to the solution. Make an immigration system that mostly takes in more educated people who are more qualified to get the kind of jobs that will allow them to afford insurance and keep off welfare, so you don't have to foot the bill. Paul Strand, CBN News, Washington.
Well, an acknowledgement and an apology from the country's largest Protestant church. The Southern Baptist Convention released a report detailing the denomination's ties to slavery and racism. Albert Mohler, president of the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, said, quote, "We must repent of our own sins. We cannot repent for the dead. We must, however, offer full lament for a legacy we inherit and a story that is now ours." The school's year-long study shows that its founders owned slaves and were deeply complicit in the defense of slavery. Molnar also added that the school will not attempt to rewrite the past, rather tell its story in full and not hide.
Well, after the break, the benefits of giving, how generosity could help your health. Jenna, it is hard to believe Christmas is right around the corner. Can you believe it?
It is. I know.
Well,
crazy.
With Christmas right around the corner, we're officially entering the season of giving.
And as CBN News health reporter Lori Johnson shows us, doing good and giving to others can also be good for the giver.
The facts are clear. Givers live longer, happier, healthier lives. Studies show generosity triggers a number of significant changes, all of them good, both mentally and physically. Here at the world-renowned Cleveland Clinic, Dr. Michael McKee develops ways to enhance the inner healing response of patients.
There are tremendous health benefits to giving.
Stress leads to illness, and Dr. McKee says giving can reverse the deadly effects of stress. It doesn't matter whether you give time or money, or if it's to a loved one or complete stranger.
Well, we know that the giving tends to reduce blood pressure, slow heart rate. Again, giving reduces stress. It reduces depression.
Researchers from the National Institutes of Health studied MRIs of people who gave to various charities. They found generosity stimulates the reward center in the brain, releasing chemicals that strengthen our immune system.
And we know again that there's a release of endorphins. These are the kind of magical chemicals that come from various areas in the brain, and they flood throughout the system. They're cousins, basically, but some reduce pain, some kind of seek out sick-looking cells and exert a healing effect on them. They have many different positive effects.
Dr. Stephen Deutsch is the chairman of psychiatry at the Eastern Virginia Medical School. He says doctors commonly use giving in treating depression.
We encourage people to not be so self-absorbed and to think about others. We even tell people to practice being concerned and invested in other people.
He says the more people give, the easier it gets.
Sometimes they may feel initially that it's fraudulent, that's not really who they are, but over time, it becomes more and more comfortable for them, and it does have a powerful therapeutic effect.
So people who feel powerless or worthless find a new purpose and value by seeing their actions help others, and they tend to live longer and healthier lives. Lori Johnson, CBN News.
So the lesson, if you want to live longer and happier, it's better to give than to receive.
That's so true. Have you gotten your Christmas gifts yet?
I've gotten a few, but I still have a little bit more to get done.
Yeah, me too.
Thanks for calling me out. Well, that's going to do it for tonight's Faith Nation.
Have a great evening.